Over the past 3 decades, U.S. corporations set up shop in Ireland. In 1996, about 3% of U.S. businesses with global operations had Irish affiliates. By 2022, 25% of them opened Irish businesses.
You really cannot talk about U.S. multinationals in the last few decades without talking about Ireland. Big U.S. corporations, that's technology companies like Apple, Microsoft, for big pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer. Their tax strategies for many decades at least were built around the role of Ireland.
Something like 15% of Ireland's workforce is employed by U.S. firms. And they've also seen higher wage growth and more job opportunities.
What does America first mean?
A key economic advisor to President Trump called out Ireland in an appearance on the All In podcast in March.
The country of Ireland, they have all of our IP for our great tech.
All the tech companies.
All our great tech companies and great pharma companies.
And pharma, yeah.
They all put it there because it's low tax.
Yeah.
And they don't pay us, they pay them. So that's got to end.
Why Ireland? Tax loopholes are a huge part of the answer.
All of this tax avoidance was facilitated, enabled, and on some level blessed by the U.S. government.
But as Congress refines the U.S. tax code, politicians hope that some companies will bring more business back to the states. Here's how some of America's biggest companies use Ireland to reduce their tax bills. A large range of American companies stow their intellectual property in Ireland, particularly tech companies. To illustrate this, let's pretend to set up our own multinational tech firm, BigComp. BigComp's assets are entirely controlled by a holding company that's based in the US. It's called BigComp Holding Company, and it has a subsidiary, BigComp International. The subsidiary is based in Ireland, where tax rates are relatively low. BigComp is working on a new smart device. The Irish subsidiary buys licenses for its hardware, software, and design features at a very competitive price from its parent company. Lucky us, the product is looking like it'll be a hit. We go on to sell millions of dollars worth of product. Much of the revenue is taxed at a lower rate because that profit was made by BigComp International.
If you are Apple or Pfizer, your value comes primarily from the intellectual property, from the iPhone design, the patent rights to major pharmaceuticals. Those are legal property that you can move from your headquarters in the US over to a subsidiary in Ireland.
US tech companies, including Microsoft, Alphabet, and Apple, allegedly use strategies like these to lower their tax bills. In 2024, the top US corporate income tax rate was 21%, but this group paid much less than that. Pharmaceutical firms like Pfizer appear to use these strategies too. The drug maker reported relatively low tax rates for the past 3 years.
When you transfer the rights to the patent on a new blockbuster megadrug, the profits on that drug are going to end up wherever those ownership rights are. We usually focus on technology and pharmaceuticals because those are really the big ones, but it's not just them. Like Coca-Cola, the value in Coca-Cola comes essentially from the recipes. Those are intellectual property.
These companies tend to set up shop in Ireland. There are over 950 US firms with subsidiaries there.
Ireland, being a Commonwealth country like the United States, shares a very similar legal system. That's something that makes American, Canadian companies very, very comfortable in terms of how their intellectual property will be protected. It's a wholly different situation than if you were in, for example, China.
If the quirks of international IP laws are fully leveraged, a corporation could potentially avoid much of its tax bill. Take, for example, Apple. In the year 2014, their effective corporate income tax rate was below 1% in Europe. Apple and Pfizer did not respond to CNBC's request for comment for this story. Microsoft declined to comment. By 2003, Ireland's corporate tax rate was set to 12.5%, one of the lowest rates in Europe at the time. This, combined with other policies, enabled a strategy known as the Double Irish.
What the Double Irish tax strategy allowed a corporation to do was effectively make its profits disappear. It requires 2 Irish subsidiaries, and one of them would be neither a tax resident of Ireland, but would also not be considered a foreign subsidiary by the US government. They usually will end up in a real tax haven with very, very low tax rates, sort of Bermuda, the Cayman Islands. Those are the big ones here.
It was a sort of an escape valve from high tax countries that had, in the US's case, the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world. And it allowed businesses in the US to access global markets at lower tax rates without being kneecapped by what was, at least pre-2017, an incredibly uncompetitive tax system.
The double Irish would not have been possible without both quirks of Irish tax law, but also quirks of US tax law that are unusual compared to other countries.
As the strategy caught on, shares of US corporations with Irish subsidiaries soared. This boosted the Irish economy, enough to surpass growth in the US by some metrics.
These strategies are ways of bringing real economic development to their country.
Ireland planned this strategic shift as its economy struggled in the 1980s, sparking waves of migration and population decline.
Dublin has the youngest, the fastest growing, and the most unemployed population in Europe.
There was a very concerted effort by the Irish government to bring U.S. investment into Ireland. That started happening in the 80s when things, frankly, were not great. In Ireland, there was a high level of unemployment, but within that unemployed population, you had very well-educated people with a high skill set. Many of them emigrated, but for those that did not, there was a huge opportunity. That was clearly a driver of tax strategy to make it even more attractive in the 90s. It helped that Ireland became part of the EU.
The economic impact on Ireland has been, in some ways, enormous, but certainly not all of that has been actually felt by Irish citizens. The other aspect of it, which is much more real, is the budgetary effects. When you are putting a low tax rate on an enormous amount of profit, that leads to huge corporate tax receipts. Then, the last aspect of it, which again is real, and that could be, opening office buildings in Ireland. Pharmaceutical manufacturers especially have actually moved a lot of their real operations, their manufacturing operations, into Ireland.
These tax strategies, set decades ago, revved up a global battle over corporate tax revenues. Some observers argue that these arrangements can be beneficial.
There are a lot of jobs created in the United States because of that relationship.
Ireland is now the 6th largest investor in the US, so it's a mutually beneficial relationship. At this juncture, there are well over 150,000 people employed by Irish companies in the US.
Tax competition, this ability of businesses to choose the most friendly place to do business, has actually been a good thing, not just for tax revenue, but also for workers, wages, and economic growth and innovation overall.
Other countries have pressured Ireland to change its ways. Importantly, members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
They were looking at what multinationals from the US and from Europe were up to, all of this shifting of profits around, avoiding taxes, a lot of political pressure on Ireland. It seems like less so from the US side, funnily enough, even though probably the US was losing much more.
Ireland phased out this tax strategy from 2015 to 2020. Still, other loopholes persist, bringing major business into Ireland. In the US, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act lowered the top corporate income tax rate from 35% to 21%. The bill also reduced corporations' ability to defer their US taxes on foreign income.
If you're a US multinational, you are earning profits abroad, you are paying a very low foreign tax on those profits, and we're going to bring you up to some minimum tax rate. If you never repatriate those profits, then the US will never tax you on that profit.
Companies like Microsoft and Apple continue to report billions of dollars in deferred taxes. Think of it like a tab that remains open at the bar.
You could be accumulating profits abroad. And then, the neat trick that multinationals played here is you have this big stack of profits accumulating abroad. You can go to a financial institution and say, look, I have all these profits abroad. You use that as collateral for a loan, and you can use that loan in the US to pay out dividends to your shareholders.
The major tax and spending bill making its way through Congress only makes marginal changes to this situation in its current form.
So, the change here is that nothing will change. Really, the big winners from all of this were big US multinationals. And the big loser here is the US taxpayer, or, the Treasury, the US federal budget, which was not collecting tens of billions over decades, hundreds of billions in tax revenue that most people would say properly should have been in the US.